Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.
Hari Hara Priya Kannan serves as the Chief Data Scientist at the Demographics Group, contributing her expertise to the data-driven columns authored by the esteemed Bernard Salt and Simon Kustenmacher. Hari holds a master's degree in data science from RMIT University and regularly writes a column for the Australian's Real Commercial Property Supplement. Hari is an experienced speaker and panellist, having participated in numerous conferences across Australia. Her presentations cover a wide range of topics, including housing, home ownership, business formation, international education, ageing and strategic planning. Additionally, Hari has been featured on various property-focused podcasts where she discusses Australian demographic trends. Great to have you on the podcast, Hari.
So exciting to be a part of this podcast. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Before we get to demographics and the data, I'm wondering when and how you migrated to Australia.
I came to Australia in 2017 as an international student. So I did my master's in RMIT University. So the moment I landed in Melbourne, I just fell in love with Melbourne. So I really wanted to get some work experience in Australia. So I continued on with my post-study visa. And once that was done, I moved into an employed sponsored permanent residency visa.
Phenomenal. And can you share a bit about your journey into data science and demographics more specifically? What drew you to this field?
Basically, I had a bachelor's degree in computer science engineering, and I did some work as a software engineer in India. And during the time, there were numerous opportunities in data science and AI. So I wanted to study a bit more in that field because that would be beneficial in the long term. And we had a very good courses available in Australia, and especially in RMIT University, where I studied. The course was very good and it was very up to date. And they had numerous partnerships with Microsoft, and they taught the latest technologies. So I felt it was the right choice for me to come here. And once I graduated, I got into the demographics group as a data analyst. And from then, I started seeing the value in the interpretation of demographic data. And the most fascinating thing about Australia is the wealth of data that's available to us. We have very, very good data in the ABS. We have various government bodies that release data on a periodic basis. I don't think there is any other nation that has this kind of wealth in data. I felt that it would be a good place to start my career, and I started learning more about the Australian demographics, and that's how I got into the field.
On the point about Australia and the wealth of data, because we do have a lot of publicly available data, of course, and the freedom of information regime also provides that added tier of access to data and information. So it's really interesting. But obviously, having the data is one thing, and then interpreting, analyzing is another. And we'll get to some of your insights shortly. Now, how did your experience at RMIT University shape your approach to data analysis and demographics more generally?
I had the opportunity to do real time projects when I was in RMIT, and I was one of those few lucky students who got to work with my professor. And I also did another internship with Coles, and that really gave me an insight how well the data is being used in Australia. So it's not like I'm just developing a proof of concept. It's something that's used in real time. And that was very exciting because back in India, where I used to work, it was mostly service based and it was not something that was really value adding. You don't really see the value add. And because the companies are very big in India and you're like one among 1,000 people. So most service-based tech companies in India hire thousands and thousands of people. So it's not easy to for your talents to come out there. It's not easy to get the opportunities. Whereas when I work here, I find that most of the data teams, especially, are very small, and the work they do is very impactful. So it's not just redundant work. Everything is very useful and meaningful, especially with the work that I do right now, reflects a lot of trends that are happening in real time. And the data here is so on point that if you look at historic ABS data, you kind of connect to how things have panned out in the past. So that gives you the faith to really come up with strategies for the future.
You're in quite a unique position too, because you're not just a data scientist or a demographer.
Mhm.
You bring to the table your unique perspective. I am wondering how your unique perspective as a migrant has impacted the way you understand and explain the data that you handle.
I think my background has helped me a lot, especially when I look at the population data and the workforce data. It's very relatable, I would say. So the one of the things that I luckily have is a good mentorship from my boss Bernard Salt and Simon Kustenmacher. So they have also played a key role in really pushing me into the interpretation part. So I was a technical person. I had no speaking skills. I had no presentation skills. I had no people facing skills as a graduate. So these are some of the things that I have had access to. And I don't believe a lot of migrants have access to this kind of support. I know a lot of my friends who are facing, I'd say, workplace difficulties, but luckily I don't have that.
I am really interested about migration trends and demographics, your area of expertise. It's often said that Australia is a trading nation and that we've benefited immensely from decades of globalization driven macro trends. By way of example, Australia's GDP per capita in USD or US dollars in the mid 90s was just under $20,000, which meant that we were roughly number 20 in the world. Fast forward 30 years, and Australia now ranks 10th out of 195 nations with around $67,000 per capita USD. We've gone up 10 spots in 30 years, which is quite remarkable. Many commentators attribute this in significant part to the role that migrations played. However, others suggest that GDP per capita is a flawed measure for various reasons, including that it doesn't capture the distribution of wealth and that there is significant disparity amongst generations of Australians on that measure. Should we pay much attention to GDP per capita when trying to understand just how prosperous we are?
I get that people think that a GDP per capita is a flawed measure. Yes, wealth is not evenly distributed, but it's an average. So when we take many measures, we usually take the average. And if it is flawed in Australia, the measure is likely to be flawed for other nations as well. So overall, if we look at our rankings, we do have a very high GDP per capita. The other thing I want to highlight here is if you take the top 15 countries by GDP and then you re rank them by GDP per capita, Australia ranks second on the list. it's not just that. Let's look at the population growth of the top 15 economies as well. So the only other country that beats Australia is US in terms of GDP per capita, but their outlook for population growth is less than Australia. So US is only expected to grow by 0.6% over the next annually, but Australia grows by 1%. And the key thing here is the working age population. Globally, we are aging, and Australia's working age population grows by 12% in the next 2 decades compared to US, which is just 3%.
There's a significant difference there.
Yes, there is. So if you look at countries overall, we have a high GDP per capita. Yes, we have a spending power, but we can also explain that we have a higher number of people who are working and running the economy. So, yes, there will be some people who generate below the GDP per capita, the average Australian, but it's not too far off, is what I mean. In general, we are prosperous, and the outlook for us is very good too.
How does a migrant fit into that measure? Do they generally contribute more or less or similar to those who are already here? Do we have any data around that?
In order to understand this, we need to look at what is the composition of migrants in Australia. So, when you take migrants, the lion's share comes from international students. Now, international education is the fourth highest revenue generating industry in Australia. So, in 2023, there were about 742,000 international student enrollments, and this converts to $17 billion in fees alone. Then on top of that, they contribute about $31 billion in spending. That is in terms of their rent, their spending, the tourism that they generate. So all these things come from international students. Now, this is a very big contributing factor to our GDP. Then we have the second group of migrants who are skilled migrants. Now, most skilled migrants come here for employment because they have to, that's how the visa works. We don't have a lot of migrants who are not doing anything. Most migrants are employed and they're contributing to the economy. Then we have family visas that's only a fraction of the overall visas that are handed out. So if you look at migrants in Australia, I'd say they give or they generate revenue more than the average Australian people, and especially international students because they don't receive any tax benefits. Temporary residents don't receive any tax benefits, but they still do pay tax and they still do pay for the visas and all the processing fees. So they don't really access any government benefits. So who's benefiting out of this is just the taxpayers, I'd say.
How about on the flip side there, Hari, particularly from a housing sort of perspective, do you see any correlation between international students or migrants more generally and the pressures that are on the housing market at the moment, whether that's ownership or rental?
With home ownership, temporary migrants don't really have access to it unless they are really cashed out. And I'd say that's not the case for most of them. They only come into the rental market. Now, the issue with Australia and our cities is that we are too CBD centric. So, if you look at all our top universities, all the jobs are mostly concentrated in the CBD. So, when a migrant comes to Australia, they come here with maybe just the location of their work or their university, and they tend to find housing in and around the area. So, if two-thirds of our population growth is coming from migration, and these migrants are going into our universities and filling our skills shortage, then you have the lion's share of them just going into the CBD. So you can see how that creates a bottleneck situation for the urban areas. The only solution for this is to either need to spread out or move up, is the only
Sure.
solution.
Interesting points. Now, Australia's urbanisation rate consistently has been above 80% for many decades now. And in 2023, it reached its highest ever rate at 86.62%. Despite a fairly decentralised federal model of administration, we've had a relatively high population concentration around the eastern seaboard, with Melbourne and Sydney in particular. This has presented unique challenges for governments of all persuasions who have, since federation, aspired to grow the regions and better distribute the population. In your article that was published in February 2024 in The Australian, you considered Australia's population projections for the next 50 years, arguing that while a rise in population currently brings about notable housing challenges, a decline in growth will introduce fresh hurdles in the housing and real estate sector. Relevantly, you wrote, a declining population will exacerbate the already low economic growth in regional areas where population growth is vital for the area's development. In such regions, a diminishing population can lead to decreased economic activity, limited job opportunities, and reduced demand for goods and services. How does internal migration within Australia, e.g., from cities to regional areas or vice versa, compare with international migration in terms of demographic impact?
So for years up until COVID, we always had a migration to the capital cities from the rest of the state. That's how it has been, except for Queensland. That was the case for both Victoria and New South Wales. But during the pandemic and what work from home did to us was enabled us to move out farther. So two things contributed to this movement. One is the millennials who have entered into the family formation stages. So they are after family sized housing. If you look at Melbourne, new houses that are affordable are only available in the urban fringes. And this is the case with Sydney too. So work from home, along with the family formation of millennials and the pandemic, made people think their current situation. Why would they pay a premium to stay in an inner city suburb when they can have a bigger house and only commute to work maybe 2 times a week? So this really pushed regional population growth. So if you look at pandemic population, regional population trends, a lot of people migrated out of the cities and into the regions. What was expected was when we come out of the pandemic, this trend will reverse and people will come back into the city. But that has not been the case. Regional population growth is still continuing very strongly. So this is an effect that was observed because of population growth as well, because we have more people coming into the city than driving people out. And this also enabled home ownership and boosted regional areas.
Should that be welcomed? Like, is that a trend that should be nurtured and encouraged through the appropriate policy measures?
It definitely should be. If anything, we need to come up with more policies to support especially migration in regional areas. I think the government did come up with a number of visas and incentives for international students going into regional universities, but it's just not as attractive, and there are not enough employment opportunities in the regions. What this population growth will do to the regions is it will increase the demand for services there. That will in turn create jobs and that will encourage more people to move there. So when our population growth is more spread out, that will be a major factor in relieving the housing crisis. And on top of that, it's more sustainable for us to do that than just rely on two of our cities to take the entire load of the population
I've
growth. Yeah.
I find that there's a bit of a circular situation here with the chicken or the egg, which one came first situation. Like, do you need to have job centers, job hubs, and various amenities in a regional area already there in order to attract, whether it's overseas migrants or other people from the cities to the regions? Or is it the population that brings about all these flourishing circumstances? What is it in your view?
It's always the population growth that drives businesses. So if I was a business owner and if the government gave me incentives to move to a regional area, I wouldn't move there if I knew that I didn't have enough customers. So that's not how a business owner or any business would operate. So services are created by demand, and demand is created by population growth. And that's how it happens. So it's impossible to understand the demand of a local market without understanding what kind of population growth is going to happen there. So, for example, there are a few regions that are benefiting only from population growth, mainly from retiree population. And therefore, we need to cater the services to that population. So, that's how I think the regions can be stimulated.
Now, if private enterprise won't go there, if for whatever reason the incentives are not sufficient in the eyes of private businesses, do you think that governments should themselves move various departments, agencies, bodies to these regions? I think there's been some of that happening, like, for example, in Geelong, in Victoria, and in Newcastle, up in New South Wales. What's your take on that as not necessarily a substitute for private businesses, but more so as a leading initiative in order to set the circumstances for perhaps others to join?
I think that's a very good example for governments to be doing that. And it's always when public workers are moving to a location that also increases the, I'd say, the trust factor for private enterprises to go to that location. They would follow there. It's a very good initiative. But I think that overall, we need to really have policies that are in place that really encourages people to go there. For example, we had a visa system when I came here as an international student. It allowed 1 year of extra time on your visa for your post-study visa, and it also gave you extra points for the general skilled migration program. But I'd say most of the students were not taking that up because they were scared that they wouldn't get a job afterwards.
So, is this despite knowing that such incentives were in place?
Mhm.
They nonetheless were pessimistic about it. Okay.
Yes. So if you want to attract a younger crowd, you need to make the city more attractable to the younger crowd. So if you look at most regional areas, they are dead after 5 p.m. There's nothing to do, and it doesn't really encourage young people to move there because there is no opportunity to socialize and learn. When an international student comes out of their home country, it's not just after the education, it's after the experience.
Of
And
course.
yeah, you don't really get the experience in regional areas. So that is another factor to consider.
We'll come back to this topic in a while because I'm interested in how a sense of community can be fostered in regional areas amongst migrants and the natives. I do wonder now, there's key sort of demographic trends in Australia, some of which you've alluded to. I'm wondering, how does the aging population in Australia interact with migration trends, particularly in terms of the need for younger skilled migrants?
With the workforce, the issue is 2 out of 3 businesses are finding it very difficult to find young workers or any workers at all. So the skills shortage is one of the biggest problems that businesses are facing. Most businesses and people really welcome skilled migrants because we get our workers only from migration. That's how it has been. And 2/3 of our population growth comes from migrants. We don't make enough babies. Therefore, we don't have young workers. And this is a trend that is going to continue into the future. That's how that's the outlook for us. So we really have to embrace migrant workers because without them, we will have nowhere nearly enough people to plug the gaps. So over the next 10 years, as per jobs and skills data of the Australian government, we need 2 million workers. An ABS survey, which was conducted last year, revealed that 1.5 million workers were looking to retire in the next few years. So we already have a demand of 3.5 million workers. During the same time, our migration is planned at 2.7 million. Now, this 2.17 million figure includes international students, so all of them won't be coming into our workforce. Then we have visitors, and then we have humanitarian visas. So the skilled migrants that we are taking out of this 2.7 million is even a smaller figure. So we don't really have enough workers. That is the situation we are looking at.
What would that mean if those projections held true and that gap wasn't closed? Let's presume that for a second. What would that mean in terms of wage inflation? Or would that lead to real wage growth? Or how would that impact that? Because presumably, when there's an imbalance between supply and demand in the labor market, that would lead to a rise in wages, you'd think.
There will be a wage growth, but only for entry level workers. Because it will be difficult to find entry level workers because we have baby boomers who will completely exit the workforce. Then we won't have enough Gen Z workers who are coming into the workforce. So when you look at workers who are newly entering into the workforce, they are obviously not going to enter into mid level and top level positions. It's all entry level. So what will happen is companies will fight tooth and nail to get these entry level workers. They will end up paying more for them. They will end up changing company policies around them because we are looking at hiring Gen Z who have their own unique needs. They're not easily attractable as millennials or the previous generations. Finding them and aligning to their work values will be very difficult. So this will create a problem within the company. So if you have entry level resources who get paid more, you it will affect the hierarchy within the company. So these are some of the challenges that businesses might face in the future because of the overall aging and skills shortage issue. But I don't think there will be an overall wage growth across the board.
And it's also unknown as to whether there'll be productivity gains, if so, to what extent from
Mhm.
like an advance in technology. In particular, I'm thinking artificial intelligence. A lot's been said about that. That could potentially play a bit of a role, you would think, right?
We definitely need to embrace AI and technology wherever we can because we are going to be doubling the number of people who are aged 85 and above in the next 10 years. We need people to be working in roles that are not easily replaceable by technology, which is healthcare, which is all service based occupations. These are areas where we really need people, and that is where we have the shortage too. What we can do starting from now is embrace tech where we can, make our retraining and just scaling up more accessible to everyone across the board. It needs to be both for entry level workers and the older workers. So people get into the system faster. There should be incentives for industries like healthcare where we human work and labor is needed. Those industries must look to attract more people.
Do you think we're behind the eight ball in this respect? How do you view our, for example, our tertiary education delivery model? Is it sufficiently enabling and empowering the future workforce to embrace these advancements in technology, or is it still stuck in the old school ways? I know you mentioned your own personal experience, which was quite heartening. I mean, it sounds
Mhm.
like RMIT, or at least the course that you studied, had very much that integration happening. But is that the same, do you think, across the board in Australia in terms of our tertiary education system?
The tertiary education system in Australia is very practical and it's very on point and it's one of the best. And I say that from personal experience. Yes, universities are embracing technology, new things that are coming into the market are being taught as as a part of the course. So I'd say it's very good in that manner, but it all depends on which field you're choosing for yourself. There are some fields that are more susceptible to automation than others. It depends on what you choose and how you work with it. Now, if you take data science, for example, there are already many tools that automate several aspects of data science very well without any need for a human worker there. So you need to find what is the skill that I can add, which is a value add for my company and for me to sustain in this field. In my case, it's data interpretation rather than just doing algorithms and
Mm.
programming, I'd say. So, because now ChatGPT can write code. So, if my core skill was writing code, I wouldn't
You could
say
have an
I'd be,
issue.
yeah, our universities are doing a very good job because we get
Sure.
trained with
Well,
data visualization and interpretation and
mm.
presentation skills as well.
Whether it's a $40 billion industry or a $20 billion, regardless, it's a significant industry that we've created in the last couple of decades, really. But sometimes it's not acknowledged and it seems to be scapegoated from time to time. Having said that, I think there are inefficiencies within that system that should be perfected. And I guess that's where the policy makers come in. Now, migration more broadly is a hotly contested topic, as you know. Not everyone is pro
Mhm.
migration, if I can put it that way. Now, anti globalization sentiments seem to be gaining momentum in many comparable nations. Aside from eternal optimists and foreign adversaries with ulterior motives aiming to create division in what they perceive as rival societies, most credible observers view these trends as introducing new challenges rather than opportunities. How might changes in global migration patterns, e.g., due to climate related challenges or perhaps political instability, affect Australia's demographic future?
Globally, we are aging. It's not just Australia. So if you look at the global population outlook from UN, we will reach peak global population at around 2086 at 10 billion, and then we start declining. What happens is on a global level, we will be aging because obviously life expectancy is much better than what it used to be, and fertility level is not as good as what it used to be. So we are increasing the older population who will live longer. And not just in Australia, but across many first world countries, aging is a popular problem. If you look at Japan, they already have a higher percentage of older population. This is going to be the case everywhere. So moving forward, I think that countries would try their best to attract younger workforce. So the younger workforce is, if you look at countries that have a higher population of young workers, it's India that's leading at the moment.
Mm.
Then you have several African countries. That's where you get your young workers from in the future. So this whole anti-globalization thing, I think it's not really based on any data. So the
Mm.
real-time picture is much different to what's happening. That's what the data says, at least.
Perhaps more science, less politics would be more beneficial to everyone. In an article that was published in November 2023 in The Australian, Bernard Salt, your colleague, remarks that Australia's best asset is our tolerant and easygoing nature. You yourself have described Australia as a land of migrants since European settlement, with a consistent influx of new arrivals, resulting in continuous national population growth. According to the first comprehensive census that was conducted in 1891, 32% of the population was born overseas. In 1947, this percentage dropped to 10%, and in 2022 reached 29.5%. The 2021 census found that almost half of Australians have a parent born overseas, 48.2% to be specific. These numbers are statistically and otherwise significant, and the debate about national identity ranges on hotter than ever. Amidst this backdrop, some have questioned Australia's multicultural identity, arguing that we are gradually losing the essence of what it means to be a unified collective. In contrast, others have dismissed that view, labelling such sentiments misplaced, manufactured, or inconsequential to the extent that it represents disappointment associated with waning privileges. How do you see migration influencing the cultural diversity and social fabric of Australian communities?
In my own personal experience, I think Australia is a very welcoming country when compared to other countries like Canada and US, who are the other English speaking countries with a large migrant intake. I think this stems from the fact that most of us have, or half of us have, a parent who is born overseas, or we ourselves are from overseas. So being multicultural is an identity of Australia. It is one of the things that makes us who we are. And this is happening since the 1800s. So the data says it. We can't deny it. Most of these negative sentiments, I'd say, come from being misinformed.
Hari, what is your message to aspiring migrants?
Do your research properly. That is key to success in Australia. So choose a field that closely aligns with your goals, but also choose something that is sustainable and beneficial. And if you are looking to move to Australia, look for a skill that is in demand in Australia. And I'd say that with proper efforts, Australia is a very, very good country to live in. And I've only had positive experience here, both with the people I've met and the quality of education and lifestyle that was offered here for me.
Hari Hara Priya Kannan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.